In this video, we're going to overcome your fear of wiring diagrams. I'm Lugnut Lang, thanks for watching. There is nothing more frustrating than when you have an electrical problem on a vehicle and you have no idea where to start looking at it. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a real problem I'm having on my 1966 Thunderbird. We're going to be looking at the courtesy light system, we're going to be looking at why the courtesy lights don't work, and we're going to evaluate what we can do to fix that, and we're going to look at the entire system as a whole, starting with the wiring diagram. We're going to use a multimeter, and we're going to tear into it to help you understand what the steps are that are necessary to diagnose an electrical problem. This is my 1966 Thunderbird project. This is an awesome car with a ton of potential. This car is a field find car. It sat in the field in Hamul, California for about 20 years, half under a carport. It was definitely a rodent hotel. I'm going to be dealing with that for quite some time. My goals for this car are just to get a comfortable cruiser on the road, freshen up the suspension, get the interior nice, and I'm well on my way to getting that done. I don't know about you, but when I pull up something like this wiring diagram, I tend to find it extremely overwhelming. So what I want to do is I'm going to walk you through how to read the wiring diagram. I'm going to throw it up on the screen here and I'm going to highlight some different parts of it, and we're going to go over how to read an old school wiring diagram like this. If you can read this wiring diagram, I truly believe any wiring diagram you come across, you'll be able to read, figure out, and identify the components of it on the vehicle you're working on. So when you're looking at a wiring diagram like this, the first thing you want to look at is the key. There's going to be a key or a legend which explains certain items on the diagram to you. In this diagram, most items are labeled at their location within the diagram, but one thing that stands out to me is that a splice is specifically noted as a round dot where a couple of wires intersect. That's in the legend on this diagram. The legend also tells us what colors each wire is. Each wire is given a number in several places on the diagram. And by using the legend or the key, we can identify what wire we're looking at and what color it should be on the car. When you start looking at a wiring diagram like this to understand the system, it helps to start by identifying the components of the system you're working with. Oftentimes, a wiring diagram such as this will have several different systems on it. You can see in this wiring diagram, there's some interior lights, there's windshield washers, there's some gauges and gauge lights, there's some sending units, there's a bunch of stuff on this wiring diagram. So what you want to do first is you want to identify where is the item that I am looking for on this wiring diagram. So I'm going to start by identifying the courtesy lights. With the courtesy lights identified, I want to understand exactly how the courtesy light system works. What triggers does it have? What turns it on? What causes the system to work? And once I have an idea of how it works, why it works, then I can start to troubleshoot what isn't working about it. The easiest way for me to understand all of that is to start with one item on the wiring diagram. In this case, I'm going to start with one of the courtesy lights, and I'm going to trace that back to its point of origin to understand it. So highlighting this courtesy light, I can see that it goes into a connector. One side of that connector goes to ground. Ground in 12-volt electronics is effectively the negative battery terminal. And the other side of that, I'm going to trace and follow it, and I can see that it goes a few different places, both eventually ending up at the courtesy light switches. What that tells me is that the courtesy light is grounded close to the light and collects positive power from the courtesy light switch. So we can identify that the courtesy light runs to the courtesy light switch, through the courtesy light switch, goes back to a connector, and eventually from one of the courtesy light switches runs back to the fuse panel where it picks up positive 12 volts. We can track that both courtesy light switches get this same positive 12 volts by working through the rest of the wiring harness, and that enables us to understand what's really going on with this system. So having identified how the circuit works, how can we go from the wiring diagram to the car and figure out what's wrong? We're going to start by looking at the key and identifying what color wires we're looking for. The main wire numbers that we're looking at in this diagram are 53 and 54. 53 is black and blue, and 54 is green and yellow. We know that we're looking at the courtesy light switches and the courtesy lights themselves. We know that there are a couple of pillar courtesy lights. we know that the entire system picks up power from the fuse panel. In order to proceed, I want to show you how to use a multimeter. Now this is a cheap, crappy one that makes a noise all the time. Super annoying. But there's two functions that I want you to know about. One is the ohms function, or the resistance function, denoted by the ohm symbol. This function allows you to identify when there is a resistance value. Now this multimeter's got an issue. It started making this noise all the time, but it still works. So when I touch these together, it reads 0. That means there is 0 resistance between the leads. If I were to put these both to metal on the car body, I can get a resistance value, small resistance value, by touching it to two different spots on the car body. The second function, which is also important, is the voltage function. The voltage function allows you to measure if there's any voltage present. So typically you would set this to something like the 20 volt range for car electronics, a larger range if you're working with a greater amount of voltage. And this would tell you if you have any voltage present, and it will read positive 12 volts, negative 12 volts if you have the leads backwards, or maybe 9 volts or 8 volts. But this can tell you if you have a voltage drop problem, and it can also tell you if you have voltage present or if there's nothing at all. Now, we know this system to involve the courtesy light triggers, which go right here. And we also know this system to involve the courtesy lights. There's courtesy lights on both doors, and there are courtesy lights on the pillars. So for the moment, we're going to start with the doors, and we're going to see if we can identify what the problem is. Looking immediately for this switch, obviously this switch is not present, so that's a problem. So the switch isn't present. We need to identify what wires would go to it. If you remember, we're looking for a black and blue and a green and yellow wire. Now, I think that's what we're looking at right here. This is a black wire with a blue stripe. The dominant wire color, the primary wire color, is always listed first. And this is a green wire with a yellow stripe. And clearly there's been some rat damage to these wires. I can't even blame Ethan for this. So the first thing to do is to find out if there's any voltage on either of these. So with my multimeter turned on, I'm going to touch my black lead to ground and my red lead to the wire. And there's nothing on this wire. Let's see. But we have 12 volts there. So we know that the green wire does have 12 volts at this point. So that's a positive sign. We know that the blue wire is supposed to be. So what that means is if there was a switch here, the courtesy lights should turn on. So we're going to test that. The simple test for that at the moment is to connect these two wires and see if any of the courtesy lights turn on. The only light that turns on appears to be the light on the passenger door. None of the other lights appear to be turning on back there or in the driver's door. So I told you the other switch disintegrated on me. That's where that switch would connect, is to the green and blue wires there. So with this switch installed and in place, the passenger courtesy light functions when depressed. So now it's time to troubleshoot why this courtesy light doesn't work despite the state of the switch, and why the courtesy lights in the rear don't work despite the state of the switch. Looking back to our wiring diagram, we can remember that the green wire with the yellow stripe feeds positive power to the switches, and the switches then distribute power to the lights on the black wire with the blue stripe. So what we know is we should be looking for a black wire with a blue stripe that runs to these rear lights. Now there's a lot less electrical damage to the rear half of the car than the front half of the car, so we're going to start by looking for anything obvious that might be causing those lights not to work. First, we start by inspecting the bulbs themselves. They don't visibly appear to be blown, so I have no reason to believe that those are the culprit. Then we start examining the wiring as it feeds out of them. Wiring comes down, doesn't really appear to be visibly damaged anywhere. We have a torn vacuum line, but again, the wire doesn't appear to be visibly damaged anywhere, so we're just going to trace this wiring towards the front of the car, and what we come to is a bunch of disconnected connectors. These are actually connectors I disconnected while I was repairing this main part of the harness up above. So one of these connectors possibly carries the wires that we're concerned about. After poking around a little bit, I was able to determine that this wire appears to have, this connector rather, appears to have a black wire with a blue stripe in it. So upon connecting this connector to its other half, we find the rear courtesy lights do in fact come on. So far we found that the switches aren't present. We've resolved that problem on one side of the car. We found that a couple of wires were damaged where the switch is on this side of the car. And we found that a connector that takes power to the back of the car was completely disconnected, causing the rear courtesy lights not to come on. You can now see when I depress this switch, the rear courtesy lights go on and off as well. Only thing that's not working in the system is the passenger switch, which I still need to connect, and the driver's door courtesy light. These two wires, the green and yellow and the black and blue, are what's missing over here. It's not connected. So I'm going to feed these through here, connect the new switch, and we should have a functioning switch on this side. Let's test that. I'm going to put a piece of tape over this positive so that I don't blow the fuse real quick. Now the cool thing about the switches on this car are that the orientation of them does not matter. Either connection can go into either portion of the switch. So with that switch installed, you can see that depressing the switch turns the courtesy lights off. And similarly, it's difficult to show you, closing the door also turns the lights off, and opening the door turns them back on. Since the only thing remaining is this driver's door light, I'm going to go ahead and pop this light out and see if I can figure out what's going on with it. All right, so unfortunately, this bulb doesn't look damaged. The bulb has a little bit of like weird color in it, probably from rats, but it doesn't appear to be blown. So without being sure if the bulb works or not, unfortunately the next move on this is probably to remove the door panel, determine what nastiness is behind this, and see if there's any damage to any of the electrical in the door. Wonder if that has anything to do with this. Wow, that's disgusting. That's how the whole car was. So I got this door all opened up, cleaned out a little bit, and I'm gonna do two tests right now. I'm gonna test the ground, and I'm also gonna test the 12 volt positive to this connector that connects to the light bulb housing. So first I'm gonna test voltage again. I've got this set to 20 volts. Black with a blue stripe, I'm gonna test that one because that should be where the power is coming into the door for this light from the switch. There, I have 12 volts there. Now we're gonna check ground. To check for continuity to ground, your resistance rating matters not very much. I'm gonna go with a high resistance reading just so I can see if there's anything interesting there. Find your lead, hold this again, and then to test continuity to ground. All right, it's reading all over the place. I think it was reading through me. Yes, it's reading through me, which is kind of interesting. Continuity to ground, I'm going to check my ground wire here and there and 0. So there's 0 resistance. So this has decent ground, decent positive. So the problem is either the housing or the light itself. All right, success. Stole the bulb from that side, so I got to get a bulb in it, but we have courtesy lights that function at all 4 places. As soon as I get another bulb. I seriously hope that this video has helped you understand how to use a wiring diagram when working on your classic car or truck project. Wiring diagrams are extremely helpful things, and they can be overwhelming and very complex at times, but if you take a second to break it down, identify the components you're working with, the circuit you're working with, and take a few minutes with the wiring diagram to really understand how the circuit works, you can be empowered to identify and understand what's going on the car. Realize that each component is a potential failure point, each connection is a potential failure point, and that it's important to go through all the troubleshooting steps and identify where the failure is. You can use a multimeter to identify at what point in a circuit there's a failure, and you can use some common sense and some reasoning to look for damaged wires, broken components, and when you find that everything's good and it still doesn't work, it's time to start questioning if the component or the bulb or the switch is the culprit. If I left anything unclear, or if you have any questions, please leave me a comment. I would love to help you get your classic car back on the road.